Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Robinson-Spangler Carolina Room hosting a community read program. As many of you know, the community read is a month-long celebration of books that the staff has selected. This year, the adult topic is Tomorrow's Bread, which I hope you've been reading. Where's my copy? It's right here. I hope you've enjoyed it. Today we have the author, AJ Mayhew, with us, and she's going to talk with Dr. Tekla Johnson of Clarkson University, New York State, and they're going to
Done. This is
talk
an oral
about.
history interview.
It's a great interview, but it's going to talk about how AJ utilized historical facts and incorporated them into her novel. She spent a lot of time in the Robinson-Spangler Carolina Room, and we're happy to say that we enjoyed helping her. The community read can be found. You can find all the information you want about upcoming events at cmlibrary.org and just click on programs or events. You'll see AJ's lovely face right on the front page, and you can click there for information about tomorrow night's event, which is really the big ta-da event. But we think this one's an important event too, because we all want to know how authors gather those ideas and incorporate facts. I know we've all watched a television show and we've said, oh, I don't think that's quite right. But AJ did her homework. So and also with us is Brandon Lunsford from Johnson C. Smith University. He's the interim director, as well as the archivist and all-around good guy. And I want to shout out to Yolanda Slaughter, who is behind the scenes and has done so much for Community Read, and we really appreciate all her efforts. So without further ado, I'm introducing to you Dr. Tekla Johnson and AJ Mayhew. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll try and get those out to the folks in need. Okay? All right.
Well, good
How is
morning.
everyone?
Good morning.
Oh,
Good morning.
great,
This
great,
morning
great.
where Tekla is, she's on the road and talking to us at the same time. Isn't technology grand?
I hope she's
Um,
not driving.
no, I think she's
I
cruising.
know.
All righty.
We are
Well,
actually today at on the reservation, Aquasasne Reservation, taking students to a preview for oral history. So this is sort of related to
Wow.
what we're doing here, which is a form of a oral history. So
Yeah.
well, how exciting is that? Wow, you have all the fun. I'm in an office, a cubicle. But I'm so happy to be here with AJ. I've really enjoyed Tomorrow's Bread. And I just loved how she incorporated Charlotte and that part of Brooklyn's history that most of us, when we move here, we're just like, but this
Mhm.
happened throughout the South. It happened in Durham. It happened in
Mhm.
Raleigh. It happened everywhere. When urban renewal came through in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, it wiped out a lot of neighborhoods and created a crisis in the Black community because these were folks, this is where they live, this is where their businesses, this is where their churches were, this is where they funeral services were held, birth to death. So without further ado, I'm gonna let you guys chitty chat, and if anyone has any questions, let us know.
wonderful. Well, it is so great to see everybody, and of course, Brandon, good to see you, Sheila, and Miss AJ. AJ, can we, for the record, just go ahead and have your full name and the title of your book that we're going to be talking about today?
Sure. My full name is Anna Jean Mayhew. I'm a Charlotte native, and I wrote the book Tomorrow's Bread that Sheila is holding up. And it's a story about the Brooklyn neighborhood that's now gone.
Yes.
Mhm.
And would you just talk a little bit about your connection to Brooklyn as a child, just to sort of get a backdrop on how you created this novel?
I love that question because most people haven't asked me that. My father would take us to get ice at an ice house on McDowell Street that was across from the residence of Daddy Grace. And sometimes he would be there. And I was just awestruck. And I would stand across the street and watch the people flocking in and out. And every once in a while, I got a glimpse of him. My sister and I twice attended the Daddy Grace parade, which was a big deal. And once my mother wouldn't let us go unless the woman who worked for us went, and she was also a woman of color, went with us. And so Mary took us, and we went to the parade. And we were maybe one of 4 or 5 white people there. And it was just a thrill for me. And we did that twice. And later, when I began working in downtown, now uptown, I'd be going up Trade Street. And in the wintertime, I'm not going to call it smog, but the air was a little bit gray. And I wondered what that was. And it was from coal stoves in Brooklyn. And then one day, fast forward to 2008, I was going through uptown Charlotte. I knew Brooklyn was gone, but there was all this empty land. And of course, I was seeing Marshall Park and some other places. And I thought, why didn't they use it if they took it? And that was the genesis of Tomorrow's Bread. Where have the people gone?
Excellent, excellent. And I know that because I've talked to you once before,
Yeah.
lucky, but I know that you didn't like necessarily start out trying to write about urban renewal. You had that question in the back of your mind because you were a person who had experienced it. But talk about how you just started with character. Can you start talking, and then let's go into some of the characters, some of the excellent characters that you've written about here,
Yeah.
Laura Lee and Phoebe and everybody.
Yeah. Well, I had written Lorelei is the voice of the first chapter, and she's the only first person character in the book. And I had written a few pages of the first chapter and sent it to a man in Alabama who had grown up in Brooklyn, Leon. I'll think of his last name in a minute.
Leon
Gills,
Gill.
that's right. Thank you, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And he read it, and he told me I had the voice all wrong. And he was right. He was correct. And he said anybody who graduated from Myer Street School and Second Ward High School would be speaking correct English. And so I revised Lorelei, and that got me started on characters. And I was fortunate to listen to the taped interviews that were done back in about 2002 or 3 at UNC Charlotte of the people who lived in Brooklyn, who were by then in their 50s, 60s, 70s. And that got me started on character. These are people who live there, and I get to hear them.
Can we spend another second on dialect before we go there? Because we talked about this. So at first, the character, and you say, I don't think I'm pronouncing her name right, being from Nebraska, not from the South, but Lorelei,
Yeah.
right?
Lorelei.
Lorelei. So, but you use what I would call an authentic voice. And I think what shocked, I was prepared, by the way, I remember you did a reading early on, and I remember going there, and they said, oh, this white woman writes about the Black community from the Black perspective. And I remember thinking, I don't think she'd be able to do that. Well, I read the novel, even the first half of it, and I was blown away, along with everybody else, because the voice sounds so authentic.
Thank you.
I mean, it just, yes. And so, but it's not a straight line, because, dialect has been argued from within African American the community of literature itself. So, for example, Langston Hughes, who I want to talk about, but Langston Hughes didn't like it. Zora Neale Hurston did. What do you think about that? How did you make your decision? Yeah.
I agree totally. And so what I did with Lorelei was I gave her a couple of lapses from perfect English, because we don't all speak perfect English. And one of them was she would say, "Bibi say to me," instead of "Bibi says to me," or "said to me." Bibi say, "I'm going to go down," like that. And Bibi has the street voice because she grew up, she was born in the early 1900s and did not get the benefit. She had about a 10th grade education. So Bibi lapses into the dialect. And then the other thing Lorelei says is, "I used to," instead of "used to go." I used to go, blah, blah, blah. We all do that. Right. So I gave her a couple of little softening of the perfect English because she grew up, in Brooklyn. Right. And Uncle Ray, her great uncle, who is Bibi's brother, speaks very, very. His English is very good.
Mm-hmm.
And then Eben, the preacher, his English is just perfect.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So
variation.
variations, and
Mhm.
I really, like I said, everyone's character seems very authentic, and there are time, I would say probably a lot of the time when um Lorraine Lee does do a little dialect, it's in her head, because that's another technique. And I want us to talk about techniques with your novel. Well, we might as well do it along the way. We can go back to character in a second, but you use that. Here you are writing in the third person voice. Everybody, you're the omniscient narrator, narrator sort of. And then with Lorraine, you're all of a sudden dropping into her thoughts, and you
Yeah.
use a different media, a different method than I've seen before. How did you do it?
Well, I wanted her to be not the most important character. They're all important, but I wanted her to be the voice that takes the reader through the book. She's the narrator. And that's why I chose first person present tense. And I'm still happy with that. A couple of the people who were helping me along the way felt that it was kind of gimmicky. Maybe it is. I don't care. It worked. And then I go into third person past tense for Eben and Percy, the other two leading characters in the book. And I felt like that worked. I mean, it guides the reader into, we got to listen to this woman.
Mm-hmm.
She's, Lorelei. She's going to tell
Mm-hmm.
us this story. And she does.
And she
And then she
does.
she jumps into Eben and she jumps into Percy and and BB and Ray and all of them. She keeps jumping in. So that's why I
Well,
did it.
Well, let's talk about Percy just a little bit,
Yeah.
because this is where I think that there is a little bit of autobiographical. We
Yes.
talked about this just a little bit, and let's talk about her character a
Okay.
bit more.
Yeah, I lived about 5 blocks from where Percy lives in the book. Percy lives on the edge of Myers Park and Dilworth, between Myers Park and Dilworth at Freedom Park. And I grew up about 5 or 6 blocks south of that. And when I first started writing Percy, she was the hardest character for me to catch. I mean, the hardest. And I finally figured out it was me. So I had to back off and get me out of the book and give Percy a background. I wrote a huge amount about her that never got in the book. Her background, her father, her
Hmm.
mother, her uncle, her brother, and none of that made it into the book, but it made her different from me.
Yes,
And at the same time, having that Myers Park polish that's so different from people living in Brooklyn.
and
Or
yet,
anywhere else in Charlotte. I mean,
Yeah,
we always talk about that, the Myers Park
yeah, yeah,
accent, kind of.
yeah,
mm,
yeah.
and yet
I've,
she has a
uh
connection, doesn't she, as well to Brooklyn? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
yeah. No, I've gotten away from that Myers Park accent a little bit, but I'm still there. I can hear it in my head. Yeah,
What is her connection to Brooklyn? Because this is sort of how you open the novel. What you say, Sheila, in the very beginning.
yeah.
Yeah. How does she? What's her connection to Brooklyn?
Well, I got her into Brooklyn by having her very pregnant with her third child, and it's the first one she's carried to term, so it's a really big deal for her. And she wants a christening gown. And back in the day, my mother got her shoes done in Brooklyn, and friends of hers went to a seamstress for christening gowns and important things. So I thought, I'm going to use that. So I invented Roberta Stokes as a seamstress, and I had Percy go into Brooklyn to meet Ms. Stokes and get a christening gown made.
And just for the audience, Percy is a white woman living in Myers Park.
Uh-huh.
Miss Roberta Stokes is living on Myers Street in Brooklyn,
Mhm.
a sort of
Mhm.
a cottagey, nicer section
Yep.
of the community. Okay,
Yep. She
African
lived in
American.
Yeah, she lived in what's called Blue Heaven, but not all of Blue Heaven was blight. I mean, that was what was put out by the Redevelopment Commission, but that
Hmm.
wasn't true. And she was very stiff at first with Percy and formal. They both were. And then they kind of got down to being women, talking about babies and christening gowns and that kind of thing. So that softened Percy's initial trip into Brooklyn. And then she goes home and tells her husband where she went, and he's appalled. And he's on the Redevelopment Commission. He said, "You went there? It's
Hmm.
dangerous."
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I guess the novel, because of these two women, and not only I guess, a story of loss in some ways. It's a story of loss, and it's also, I told you, for me, I read it as a feminist novel too. But we can talk more about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I do. I read it as a feminist. But as far as loss, I was thinking about it the other day. Almost everybody lost something.
Yeah.
Laura Lee lost her mother.
Yeah.
Hawk, Laura Lee's son, lost his father.
Yeah.
Miss Roberta lost her. She loses her home. Oh, she loses her home with Brooklyn. And
but she lost two babies too. Miss Roberta did.
Okay, yes, and so the women. So how does Percy defy, or would you say she defies the trend of the community to want to get the white community to get rid of Brooklyn? How does she? Can you tell us a little bit about more about her stance? And then I want to get, if we could get into a little bit more of Lorraine Lee and Mr. Griffin and sort of some of the juicy parts of the story.
Yeah.
It's not all bad. It's not all about loss, right?
Right.
Some love in there.
Right.
Okay.
The thing about loss, I didn't even realize I was doing that as I was writing the book. And then it became apparent when I was close to done with the book. And I thought, well, that's the story it is, so I'm not going to change that. Percy meets Lorelei and her wonderful little boy, Hawk, when they take a vacation down to the coast of South Carolina to Atlantic Beach, which was an African-American beach. It was an all-black beach. The Black Pearl of the Atlantic was one of the nicknames. And then it was right next door to Windy Hill, which is where Windy Hill Beach, which is now North Myrtle. And that's where Percy and her husband had a house. Their house was 2 lots over from the line, and there was a line between Windy Hill and Atlantic Beach. And because of an accident, Percy literally rescues Hawk from the ocean. So the way she got it is she met people. And that's what always happens. We have a preconceived prejudice, and then we meet somebody, and it changes everything.
And the way you set it up, she's at the vacation spot. She's lost the 3rd pregnancy, and what you do at the beach is just phenomenal in terms of writing, I guess. What happens at the beach? She's lost a child, and what happens at the beach? So, tell that part of the story for us, will you? I should have had you read it, but.
Yeah, she's she got full term with her 3rd child, and he was born with a horrible heart defect, and he died within hours of birth. So she's got a really deep sadness with her. And her mother has given her this beach house. It has been in the family since about 1880. Her grandparents built it. So she did what she does when she needs to grieve or get away. She went down to the beach. And then she meets this woman and this boy. And she holds the boy, gets him out of the water and holds him and feels him against her. And she has the thought, this is what he would have felt like. She sees children on the beach. This is what he would have looked like. They're about, the age.
Oh, Miss AJ, I don't want to skip over it for the audience, but remember what the boy is following his mother. They go out on the rocks, and remember what happens?
Percy walks out on this groin, this rocky column that goes out into the ocean, and she walks out there, just loves getting out there on the end of it. And Hawk sees her. So he runs out on the groin, and his mother is on the beach shouting, Hawk, don't do that, don't do that. And he slips because it's rocky and it's wet. He slips and he falls and he goes into the ocean, and it's past the breakers. It's really deep. And Percy sees him, and she just dives in. And she goes down and has to come back up. She hasn't found him. She goes down again. She feels an arm or a piece of shirt and pulls him and gets him up. And then swims back to the beach where Lorelei is just frantic, of course. And Hawk has a cut on his head where he hit it on the rock. When he's falling, he hits his head. So they take him to a doctor in Windy Hill, and that's a scene that I had to work on, because the nurse is not really, the nurse is okay. She takes him in and she says, we'll call the doctor. And the doctor normally would not have seen the boy, but the nurse kind of talks him into it because it's a white doctor. in 1962.
It's so poignant that she's lost a child and she saved somebody else's
Yeah,
child for
yeah,
me.
yeah,
And then
me
now
too.
now in terms of her character, now you're taking us down this road already where she's taking the boy to the doctor, taking the family to the doctor,
Yeah,
and she can't be seen. So she's starting to learn about the
yeah,
world of the African American woman.
yes,
It's so brilliant. And what
yes,
happens next? Because I remember she goes with her husband and and he finds out about all of it. But
yeah, yeah.
take us a little further down this road. This is really
I
good.
I wanted to get her back into Brooklyn in some way, and yet in reality, she wouldn't have been there, wouldn't have gone there. And I wrote a chapter where she goes and meets Eben, the preacher, and talks with him about Lorelei and what can I do to help or make things easier when they move and blah blah blah. And my writing group talked me out of that chapter. they they said that's not real. That's not what she would have done, and I think they were right. So she collects a bunch of packing materials, boxes and papers and bottles and cans and things that tape, excuse me, tape, things that you need when you're moving, and makes a anonymous trip to Lorelei's house and leaves them on the front porch. That's about what she could do in reality.
Yeah.
She's not of today's time when we can say, wait a minute, and go
Yeah.
down and, defy. She was in the early 60s.
Yeah. But a couple of things that she does do that to me are feminist. Her husband tells her not to go back at all. So
Yeah,
she defies him and keeps his friendship and goes back,
yeah,
keeps the friendship. She also says in her head, or she says at some point, I'm glad my mother told me to keep this house, because the husband was
yeah,
thinking it should be both. And the husband
yeah.
is, so they're starting to have very divergent views.
Uh-huh.
He's part of the Urban Renewal Commission, as you said,
Hmm.
and telling her it's coming, it's coming, it's coming,
Hmm.
and she's not sure how to stop it. But
Yeah,
let's go back to the other family, to BB and Uncle Ray and
yeah.
Laura Lee has been. She's. Let's talk a little bit about Laura Lee and Mr. Griffin, because she's got some stuff going on
Oh,
as
yeah.
well.
Yeah, this is a romance novel too, know, but it's a hidden romance.
But isn't that life?
Yeah, I
There's
think it is.
romance, there's growth, there's birth, loss, death.
Tragedy.
I mean, it's a book about a chapter in life in Charlotte amongst
It
all these
is.
different people who are connected, even
Yeah,
though they can't see the connection.
yeah.
Wow. Maybe Miss Sheila, maybe that's what makes it so universal. Like a great work is very universal in application. So maybe that's part of what does it. But let's do talk about Mr. Griffith and Laura Lee, because she was a young woman working at the diner. He
Yeah.
was the owner of the diner, and tell us what happens.
Well,
Because
he
remember
was. Yeah,
when I
he
talked
was.
to you before, I only got to chapter 20. Now I've read the whole thing.
Oh,
So go on.
okay. He was manager of the S&W on West Trade Street, and it was there. It was where we went on Sunday afternoons to have dinner. I remember it well. And Lorelei applies for a position there when she's just turned 18. And he can interview her and ask her if she's married, does she have children? Because back then you could do that. So he does. And the whole time he's interviewing her, she's thinking how handsome he is. He's a white man. It doesn't matter. He's a man that makes her hot. you know. So she has to hide that, and she works for him. And finally, she doesn't hide it anymore. He gives her a bag of apples that have a little bit past their prime, and he gives them to the employees. And she's struggling to carry the bag of apples to the bus and get home, and he offers her a ride home. And that's the beginning. At one point they're talking, and she realizes this is more than just about apples.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite parts of the novel because there's a
Oh,
lot of there's a lot of loss, and I thought, oh my
yeah,
gosh, this is going to be another loss. This is going to be a lost relationship. But what happened? Is it wrong to tell the end? Maybe you shouldn't tell it.
Yeah,
What do
yeah.
you
Let's
think?
not tell the end. That should
Okay.
always
yeah,
be.
yeah,
But that was the beauty of it, how
yeah.
they worked around the laws, because you could not
Mhm.
have interracial marriage back then, but they
Right,
managed to work around that.
right.
Um, could we sort of talk about how did you get that sense of Brooklyn from using historical records? How did that help you
Oh,
write?
yeah,
Because you really captured street by street, the businesses, the people who ran the flower shop, the
Yeah.
preacher, and you had his backstory. So you had a lot of different people's backstories,
Mhm.
which I think also tells the history of Brooklyn over
Mhm.
time as well.
Mhm.
So if you
Thank
don't
you.
mind, Tekla, I'm just real
Yeah.
No,
curious about
no, and I was actually going to suggest that you talk about, as just as an extension of what Miss Sheila is saying, the use of both real and fantastical
Yeah.
characters and places, because we
Yeah.
talked about that. So,
Yeah.
can you talk about how you made those decisions too, as well as you're going forward?
Absolutely. And I'm so glad Sheila asked that.
Yeah.
My daughter did a tremendous amount of research and would send me documents about places in Brooklyn. I mean, that she found. She found actually more than I did online, and things that weren't really true there. It was important to me because they were happening other places, like the removal of African American graves. And that has happened. And so I thought, I'm going to put a graveyard in Brooklyn and they're going to take it. And I did that on purpose because it is historically accurate that that happened. And the businesses and things that I created, like Johnny No Age and his flower shop. I'm sure there was a flower shop in Brooklyn, but I never did find one. So I invented that, Stedman's Flowers. And the character of Johnny No Age was important because he was very black, and there are degrees of color, of course, and feelings attached to the degrees of color. And he was gay. And of course, he was closeted, except that finally a man moved in with him, and everybody noticed that. And Leon told me, this was so interesting, Leon Gill. I asked him about the attitude toward gays, and he said, "Oh, we were fine with them. We just called them sissies." So I used that in the book because there's a name. And if there's a name, there's a feeling and a
it.
prejudice.
Exactly,
But
exactly.
Yeah.
yet some of the names were like McKissick Shoes. I
Yeah.
think you changed the name on that one, but some
Yeah.
of them you kept, like you kept the Presbyterian Church, but you just didn't
Yeah.
call it Brooklyn.
I
You
called it
called it
Brooklyn Press. Yeah.
Timothy's.
Timothy. St.
You're right,
Timothy's.
St.
St. Timothy.
Timothy's, St.
Yeah.
Timothy's.
Yeah.
And so you did a combination,
Yeah.
and also with the House of Prayer. I think you used the House of Prayer.
I
Uh,
did a
you,
lot. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And
and
the classic, the Queen City Classic, which was
Oh
classic
yeah,
between
that was
Second Ward
huge.
and West Charlotte. Yeah.
That was huge.
The
I
Lions and
can't
the
remember if you
Tigers.
mentioned AME Zion churches because
I
the
did. I think I
okay,
mentioned it.
yeah, I just know that the really wealthy African Americans in
Mhm.
Brooklyn attended
Mhm.
the one that's on Brevard Street that still
Yeah.
stands, the
Yeah.
Tate,
That's still there.
the doc,
Mhm.
yes,
I can't think of the doctor's name, but the dentist and the doctor and
Brandon may know.
Yeah.
the gentleman who went to Sierra Leone.
Oh
Oh,
yes, he would have been
J.P. Williams.
I can see his face right now.
he had been a principal at the school, I think, one
Yeah,
of
yeah,
them.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's him. Like, can you, along with what Sheila was saying, can you give us kind of a layout of just a mental map of Brooklyn? Just kind of give us, not
Yeah.
everything, but a little sketch.
Yeah. A little sketch would be the railroad is still there north of Brevard. So from the railroad down through Alexander and Davidson and Caldwell and those streets down to Sugar Creek. And Sugar Creek was the southern boundary. There was a little bit across the creek, but not much. And it was really, those were the boundaries. And then on I'm trying to face north, on the east side would be Trade Street. And on the west side would be the boulevard, which is still there. We called it Wilkinson Boulevard back then, and Crosstown Boulevard from what was the street that joined it into Brooklyn. Anyway, it was the
Hmm.
Boulevard, Trade, Brevard, the railroad track, and Sugar Creek. Kind of
And
a rectangle.
and then inside of the community, there were different I mean, it
Oh
was
yeah,
a mix of classes. What would you say? Can
oh
you talk
yeah,
to us more about Blue Heaven? But then, can you talk more about Myers and
yeah,
what Percy saw or what you saw?
yeah. And I found out how it got the name. The big laundry that was on Myers Street or south of Myers Street, and I think it was called Domestic Laundry. And they did all the laundry for motels and hotels and things like that. And they used bluing to make the sheets white, to make them look bright. And the bluing cast off runoff went into this little creek that was a feed from Sugar Creek, and it was blue. The water
Wow.
turned blue. Now, this was back in the teens and 20s and 30s, and so it became Blue Heaven. I love that little fact. And
Fabulous.
along McDowell Street, there were restored Victorians and a couple of new houses and the really big, grand houses. And then the feed streets off of McDowell, which would have been the numbered streets, 4th and 3rd and 2nd and 1st, were close to McDowell. Really, the upper class is where they lived. And then you get down to Sugar Creek, and there was real blight. There truly was. The Development Commission claimed 72% or something like that. I could never prove that. I would say there might have been 25 or 30% blight. That's not an actual quote. That's from my research. But
I want to
they
add
wanted-
something to you. That is what
Mhm.
the oral histories that some of us have done in the community, or have read them, that's what they say too. There was
Yeah.
blight, but it wasn't anything like.
Right.
And in fact, you have your character in your novel, Miss Percy, says that about Miss Roberta's house. It's like, well, that's a little cottage. That's a
Yeah.
cute little cottage. You remember?
Exactly.
And yeah. So you really
Exactly.
bring that out. And I think,
Yeah.
well, one
Yeah.
of my favorite things about the book.
Yeah. But
And
you
if you
look at a
the-
map.
yeah.
Excuse me, what, Sheila?
You
Go
look
ahead.
at the Sanborn maps, there's lots of small
Mhm.
alleyways
Mhm.
that disappear, of course,
Absolutely.
over time. And there were houses along there as well.
Yeah.
And the other folks who lived like in First Ward along down on 7th Street,
Mhm.
that's where Mr. Tate lived, and Thaddeus Tate,
Mhm.
Yeah, Mr. Tate.
and was a very prominent African American
Mhm.
leader, businessman. But his time had passed by the time this
Yeah.
book had come
Yeah.
along.
But the funeral home, there was a funeral home of a family who lived in Brooklyn. Oh, what was the name of it? Anyway, it was a big
Yeah,
African American.
Alexander.
Alexander
Greer's or
Funeral.
those?
That's
Yeah.
exactly
Because
right.
it was right behind. It was very near Second Ward. But
Mhm.
you'll see pictures of
Yeah.
it.
That's
when they take
exactly
pictures of
right.
the students.
Now, was
And-
Greer still there too? Greer Funeral Home, was it? It's in the.
It was still there. I
there
mean, in
too.
the
Still there.
60s. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was still there. All
Yeah.
of the businesses, the big businesses, were there. The insurance company,
yeah.
the bank.
And Sheila touching on the Sanborn maps reminded me of when I first started writing the book. It was about, I don't know, 2011 or 12 or something like that. I went to the Carolina Room at the public library and met Sheila. And it might have been 2013. Were you there then?
I've been here since 1988.
Oh, golly,
I
that's
started
wonderful.
when I was 12.
That is, I love that. Yeah, I wrote this book when I was 14. Yeah. But you were there, and I walked in and said that I was looking for history and research. I was doing research on Brooklyn. And she said, okay. And she got me seated at a table, and she left, and she came back with a stack. I can't even show you here, maybe a couple 2 feet tall. And she, had it in 2 or 3 stacks. And I just started through it. And I don't know what I would have done without that and without Sheila. And then when I wanted to do a map, I had the Sanborn maps, but I couldn't find a really good map of Brooklyn. So there was a map on the wall, Sheila, over where the copier was, and it was framed. And what was his name? The other librarian, he and
Tom Cole, Dr.
Tom
Cole.
Cole, yes. We took cell phone pictures of that map, and that became the map that's in the book. Tom sent me his, and I had mine, and I had the Sanborn maps, and it just really surprised me there wasn't a really good detailed map of Brooklyn.
Well, let's talk about that ledger in your book. Is it true to that map? Is it true to the actual map, or is it mostly true and just a little bit of alteration? The map in the book. We talked about this before.
Oh,
So it's mostly true, right? With
It's
a little bit of
true.
historical fiction, you'd call it, right? It's basically, yeah. Go
no,
ahead.
the map itself is
It's
exact.
true. Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
it's true.
Okay.
And then
okay.
the list of places that accompanies the map, there she is. See, that part up there is Brooklyn. That's Charlotte. And then the next page, see, that's Brooklyn. Oh, I'm so glad you're doing that, Sheila. And that's the map
Yeah,
of
visual aids.
detail. And that is exact. And then over on the other page is the list of places that I found from the Hills City Directory of
Hmm.
1959. I went through that directory doing a search on 1st Street, 2nd Street, 3rd Street, 4th Street, Brevard Street, Alexander Street, Davidson Street, and got places that were on those streets.
And that's where you'll see the alleys because the city
Yeah,
directory is
yeah,
much more accurate in documenting a place
yes,
and time
yes.
than sometimes maps are. They're great
And
resources.
it's no longer searchable online. It made me so sad. But when I was
It,
doing it, it
I
was
figured out a
searchable.
way to do it. I'll show you how to do
I'd
it.
love to know.
It's not
I'd like
searchable, but I narrow it down
Yeah,
just by numbering.
yeah,
that would be really good. I think for all of us, that would be excellent to have. I just want to return for a minute, if we can, to Eben because he brings
yeah.
in a couple of things, and one of them is the what you guys were talking about the sort of multi-class, just the diversity within the African American community.
Mhm.
As you said earlier, he's very well educated. He's a chaplain in the military. He's a preacher,
Mhm.
and yet he is beginning to have doubts in his faith
Yeah, yeah.
after the loss of his wife, and then
Mhm.
also he has sort of another crazy. Always sort of been a sort of a good, sort of gone along with the program though, as far as the city was concerned. He wasn't really, and then he's facing a crisis, a personal crisis. Can you when they start deciding to actually, he never believed they would remove the graveyard where he sits outside of to watch
Right,
his see his
right.
wife every day. So what transformation does he have? Because I really feel like he speaks for a deep feeling within the African American community of those who were sort of civic minded, but about
Mhm.
kind of a sense of betrayal or what the cost was about
Mhm.
what the city was doing. What was his? Can you talk about his transformation and what happened with that graveyard and all of
Yeah,
that?
yeah. He goes to one of the meetings. He knows he's being asked to attend as a, you know, token, and he goes to the meeting. And while he's there, another black man comes in. What is his name? You know, that character.
Yeah,
Anyway,
I don't know.
he's full of bravado and full of himself and speaks always in the plural. We believe this, we believe that instead of I believe, or we're going to do this instead of I'm going to do this. He's royal with himself. And Eben sees him and he knows his people in Brooklyn. And he has when he sees the graves removed, he knows it's the end. And he does start to think where we're going and where will we wind up. And he finds another church. It's not St. Timothy's, but he finds another church. Is that what you were asking?
Yes, I'm asking, yeah, what is it? What is the personal human cost? Because I think that's one of the things that you bring, as Sheila was saying, you bring multiple points of view to the situation. But in terms of the African American community, here is a man who he wasn't revolutionary.
Right,
He was a citizen who ascribed to be a great,
right.
great citizen. He went along with the things as far as he could that the city did, but now he's starting to have all of these crises.
Mhm. And
Um,
I think one of the big turning points was the fire. And there was a fire in Brooklyn back in the 30s. Plum Thickets and Field Daisies, which is a wonderful book written by a teacher from Brooklyn,
Rosemary
describes.
Love.
Yes,
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 yes.
Rose Leary Love, and she describes the fire in Brooklyn. So I used that. I just brought it up into the 60s instead of the 30s. And one of the things Evan sees, his brother and he are out there helping people whose houses have burned down. And he sees that the city's response was not all that it should have been. And they are tax-paying citizens of Charlotte. And the water pressure was low and there weren't enough hydrants and that sort of thing. Now, whether that really happened, I don't know. But I'm sure it happened, maybe not in Charlotte.
Well, the roads weren't paved in a lot of places in
Right,
Brooklyn, even at the time
right,
of the destruction of it. And a lot of people, I don't think, were connected to city water.
right. Down by the creek, certainly not.
Yeah, so
There were no outhouses by 1962 that I could prove.
yeah.
I remember seeing an outhouse, but I couldn't prove if it was still used. Yeah.
So we're talking about a population of, I've read 17,000. That was 17,000, including at one time, including 12,000 African Americans in all, with the renewal in all,
Was
moved
it
out
that
of.
high? I don't remember.
Well, there is a scholar a young guy who did a master's thesis who says so. Not African American. African American, he thinks there are about 12,000, and that includes Greenville, includes Brooklyn, includes all of the
Oh,
removal
okay.
altogether.
Because in
Altogether,
Brooklyn, I think
it
it
was
was
like
less than
four.
2,000 who were relocated.
Oh, okay, and
I think
okay,
that's
and
right.
all
Yeah.
four of the. Okay, you're talking about Brooklyn proper.
Yeah.
I'm talking
Brooklyn.
about Third Ward and all that. Okay, okay, very
Yeah.
good.
Only Brooklyn. Yeah.
Only Brooklyn, but still, I think you capture with him sort of the dismay of the where will we go,
Yeah.
and I don't know if you answer it. It seems like you do, but what is the answer to where the people went? Can you help us with that?
A lot of people went north of 85. I-85 had come through on the north side of town by then, up near Johnson C. Smith, as Brandon would know. And one of the people who gave me some research lived in a really lovely neighborhood off of Tuckasegee or Sugar Creek. I think it was off of Sugar Creek Road. I can't remember for sure. And lovely development. I mean, it was a development of lovely houses, and I'm sure that there were things built like that for the people who moved from Brooklyn. And Second Ward and Fourth Ward, Third Ward, they all had to move. Yeah,
All the churches moved over there. That's
yeah.
when First Baptist, which was for the African Americans, which was on Church Street,
Hmm.
became First Baptist West. Brandon, you've done a
Okay.
great deal of study on Beatty's Ford Road and the whole corridor. Did you notice a growth in an increase in changes in businesses and population from that time period, and different houses being neighborhoods being built?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, that was there were some, there was always integrated neighborhoods over here before they were, and then like Wesley Heights, for example, is a good example. I mean, that had become a pretty integrated neighborhood, but when those other neighborhoods were torn down, the people that were displaced started pouring into there, and that's when it sort of became an all black neighborhood, and the white flight, and they all left
Mm,
for
mm,
suburbs, and again, that's a typical story you'll see like anywhere.
mm.
But yeah, that was a huge the stuff that happened in Brooklyn was a huge impact on the West Side and just the black community in Charlotte in general. Because yeah, it was
Well,
kind of a legacy neighborhood for all those churches and businesses and
Mhm.
people.
Well, this kind of coincided with the development of around South Park and Park Road.
Yes,
And so you
it
had the
did.
white flight out of Uptown,
Mhm,
and then you had these neighborhoods like Belmont, and there's some little places near Plaza Midwood, near Noda, and
mhm,
those had been predominantly white neighborhoods that were fed by the textile mill workers.
mhm.
As those closed down and they moved on to different housing, African Americans moved into those communities, and now that gentrification has taken place again. It's
Well
taken place
put.
now.
That's well put. The
Yeah,
gentrification of
the cycle
gentrification.
is continuing
Wow.
to repeat itself, unfortunately.
Can, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. I have a question I want to ask you before we forget about defending your art, but go ahead. Miss AJ, were you going to say something on this point?
No, I was
Well,
listening, fascinated. I love
I
the
have,
gentrification of gentrification.
and I guess I have three more questions, but they could be probably smushed into two. One of them is, I guess, the big one that would relate most to this before we start talking about your book awards and your defending your art, which I want to do in a second. But what is your message, I guess, with this book? I mean, different people can draw different things out of it. Is it a protest book? Is it a novel that happened? You say that the character sort of led you to it. You didn't really necessarily have the plan.
Mhm,
But what is
mhm.
is it your message? Is it the character's message? Is it the community's message? And I guess what do you feel like?
As I look, as people ask me about the book, I say, look at the neighborhood. It was 3 blocks from the square. So anybody who tells you that they were doing something good for this neighborhood is lying.
Mhm.
It was too wealthy. It was worth too much money. And to me, the message is the not having the right to go in and take something instead of cleaning it up. They could have. There was a lot of ways to do that. And one of the things I wanted to point out was that many of the people who lived in Brooklyn worked in places like Myers Park and Eastover and Dilworth. And suddenly they couldn't get to work. And I don't think the developers thought about things like that. I guess the major message would be of loss, as you pointed out, and how we deal with loss and how we live through loss and keep going. And certainly, the neighborhood being too expensive to continue to exist is a major message.
That's why I love you. I love you. I love this book. I
Oh,
love your work, because that's the same thing. Brandon and I, as you know, have been working a lot on these some of the primary documents from the city and
mhm,
the commission, who made some of these decisions. And there's certain maps in there about high tuberculosis rates, high fire alarm rates,
yeah,
and high infant mortality rates. But the question is, why didn't you send in a public health nurse if you were concerned? Why
I
did you
know,
tear it down? So that
I
was
know.
so our thinking is very much aligned with yours. So
Yeah,
yeah, if that
and
was
their
the true
only
mission, yeah.
yeah,
And
their
the
only
witnesses,
option with illness was to go to Good Sam. They couldn't go to
they
Good
had public health
Samaritan.
nurses. They had black public health nurses. Teresa Elder is one of that group. God rest her
Wow.
soul. And and there was just like about 20 of them. And of course, these are the ones who are going into these neighborhoods. But
Mhm,
that work kind of ended as major hospital became big business, and Good
mhm,
Sam came under
mhm.
Charlotte Memorial, which
You're
is now
right,
Atria.
right.
So I mean, the hospitals were so divided. The Presbyterians and the Episcopalians had their own hospital.
And
So,
Yeah.
Mercy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the
and
Catholics had their own.
we've talked to Miss Lucas, who worked at Good Sam. She's now chair of the Second Ward Alumni House. So we know. So that she was saying, if you meant well for the African American community, how would you take out the hospital?
I
So there, yeah,
know. I
yeah.
know. I
But let's
know.
talk before we and then we're gonna, I know Brandon is gonna have some more questions as well as Miss Sheila. But I guess my final questions would be about defending your art and your book awards. And and I appreciate when you defending your art, because when there's a narrative that's been repeated over and over about a community, or like what is this? William Chafee did a book called Civility and Civil Rights, that we're very much in the South into civility, appearing civil, but always sometimes the civil rights piece is, it's spoken but not always lived out. And I feel like with your book, you really took a stand that you certain things you wanted said. For example,
Mhm.
your title. Can you talk about how the
Yeah.
publisher was like no, but you said yes, and why?
Yeah. They wanted me to change the title. They said it wasn't marketable. And I had gotten that poem by Langston Hughes that's in the front of the book, which I just fell in love with. I have as much right as any fellow has to stand on my 2 feet and own the land. And so when I got to the line about tomorrow's bread, I tire so of hearing people say, let things take their course. Tomorrow is another day. I do not need my freedom when I'm dead. I cannot live on tomorrow's bread. Don't make me change that title. It's perfect. They said, well, find another phrase in the poem. I said, no. I agreed to just about everything with my first book, and then I became a diva. And I said, no, I'm not doing that. And they let me
And
have it. Yeah.
and then you also told me even a deeper connection that you had to Langston Hughes, and that he wrote a book called Misery, and he had a line in it specifically about urban renewal. Can you
Yes.
tell us that? Remember that?
Yes. Yes. What is it? It's at the beginning of the last chapter. Oh,
Yeah.
misery
Mm-hmm.
is when you heard on the radio that your neighborhood is a slum and you always thought it was home. That's core of the book, you
It
know.
sure is.
Mm. And so that's the only chapter that has a quote. And so it ties the book together. The poem in the beginning and the last chapter 33 begins with the quote from Langston Hughes. Yeah.
Now, this book came out right about COVID time, and yet it's got an award already. How did that happen? What is the award?
Well, the award is this, the community read. I just can't tell you what that means.
But before
And
that, you got one also, didn't you, for the Sir Walter Raleigh?
no,
Or was
that
that
was for my first novel.
your first novel?
Yeah,
Oh my goodness,
yeah,
you are a
yeah,
diva. What do you know?
yeah.
No.
And the last thing I had to fight for was the maps. They said you can't put a map of Charlotte on a 5 by 7 page. And I essentially said, watch me. And of course I did it. So, and I'm glad I fought for those things because they're important. And,
Yes,
and the last
it's a
thing,
visual.
huh?
Did you use any of our photographs to get a visual of
Oh,
Brooklyn?
of course I did.
Oh, good.
Absolutely. Yeah, the photographs, you'll see them in the video that we're going to play at the end of this segment. And the photographs, my son gathered them and helped produce that
These are
video.
part of our collection. If you go to cmstory.org
Mhm.
and click on African American albums 1 and 2, you really get a sense of the richness and the
Yes.
quality of life that existed in this ward and was so
Yes.
important. But you know, I when I first moved to Charlotte, they handed me 2 big volumes of photographs, and there were these gorgeous Victorian homes up and down
Mhm.
Tryon
Mhm.
College Boulevard. And I said, "Oh, where
McDowell.
are these? I
Mhm.
want to go see," because I love historic preservation. I love
Mhm.
architecture. Oh, we tore them down, and that's when I realized Charlotte's motto is, "You can build it, but we will tear it down."
Yeah.
And I will tell you, Miss Sheila, coming to the Carolina Room, and you showed me those. I've been in Charlotte for about 12 years, maybe 15, and you showed me those albums, and that is why when I was seeing the pictures of the newspaper clippings that Brandon showed me over there in his collection, there was a huge discrepancy between what they were showing in the paper about everything's a slum, we had to clear the whole area, and these
Yeah.
beautiful, beautiful homes, and it really didn't add up.
Yeah.
And as I was sitting and listening and joined in with Brandon doing oral histories,
Yeah.
the same thing is coming up with the community members saying that wasn't true,
Yeah.
that wasn't
Yeah.
true. And so, listen, I'd
And
like to thank you. Yes, go
yeah,
ahead, Miss.
one last thing that we haven't talked about that is vital is in about 2011, the big thing came up about white entitlement to write a black story, cultural appropriation.
Right.
And it made me shiver because I'd already done it with my first book. And I thought, oh my God, did I do the wrong thing? And Tomorrow's Bread is certainly an example of that. Why did I do it? Because it needed to be done. I could not find a novel that centered around urban renewal. And we learned through our stories.
Exactly.
So I don't have any regrets whatsoever about being white and writing a black story.
Because
I
that impacted us all. It impacts the city to this day, and people don't realize
Yeah,
the pain that that cause still exists today, and
yeah,
it's still a problem when anyone talks about developing
yeah,
Second Ward. And I'm
you know
yeah,
sorry, Tekla, I know your
no,
time is
oh
limited.
no, oh no, no. I just was going to add that I think that African Americans, because historically being misconstrued and stereotypes
Mhm.
and all these things, I think the fear of having whites to write about or to represent is a fear of that sort of thing. But when you get it right, but when you
Exactly.
get it right,
thank you. Thank
nobody
you.
complains. So
Yeah,
yeah,
thank
in
you.
fact, they're grateful, and so that is what you did.
Yeah.
You got it right. I just love your work, and I'm so happy to talk to you again. And I look
Same
forward to
here,
talking some more.
Tekla. It is
Yeah.
great being with you. And come back to
Okay.
the South, and
I
then let's
am.
and
Yes.
let's
I
get
am.
together.
Let's
Okay.
get together. Let's get together
Yeah.
this summer. Okay. All right. Thanks,
Okay.
everybody. I'm going to jump out
Okay.
and let Brandon and those guys take over. Bye.
Okay.
Bye, Tekla.
Bye.
Thank
Bye
you so
bye.
much for
Bye.
Bye.
joining us. That was
Bye.
Dr. Tekla Johnson of Clarkson University. She has to get back to her class. And Brandon and I are going to just chitty chat with you a little bit before we go show the video. And I hope you're all still with us. It's just to talk about how an author can use historical records and photographs and how that helps you. I'm a visual thinker.
Mhm.
And so, anytime I write anything, I have to visualize it.
Mhm.
And so, is that part of your process, or?
Absolutely, absolutely. The book that became so important to me was Tom Hanchett book. Um, Give me the title, Sheila. I'm going
Sorting
blank.
out the new
Sorting
South?
out the New South City, and it was about urban development. And so reading is not as easy for me as the visual, but I went through his book, certainly all the parts on Brooklyn, which is a big part of the book.
Mhm.
I don't know what I would have done without that. It became my Bible on writing the story. The visuals, the photos and all the information you gave me just made it come alive for me. And then, thank goodness, I got the Sanborn maps.
Mhm.
They gave me 3 of the big, great big books, like, you know, very heavy. I couldn't carry
They
all.
weigh a ton, they really
I couldn't
do.
carry them. They carried them down to my car, and I photocopied pages from that to make a wall map.
Mhm.
That every day I'm wheeling over in my chair to the wall map and looking, make sure I've got this right. So that visual was hugely important. And Oh, at the University of North Carolina, they had in Charlotte, they had a lot of information on Brooklyn, and my husband and I went down here, excuse me, twice, and saw photos and articles that they allowed me to photocopy. So
Now, I'm not clear. Did Ray Lee, because that's what I like call of
yeah,
our meetings now, did they move to Wesley Heights or did they move to near Beatty's Ford Road?
they moved up to within a mile of Johnson C. Smith. I mean, it
Well,
was
that's
in
what
that
I was thinking. Okay.
community. So I'm not sure if it's all. I think it's off Beatty's Ford.
Well, I was trying to, when she says she couldn't go and get a sandwich, and I
Yeah,
was trying
yeah,
to think, well, surely they had little snack shops near the school. I don't know. I mean,
yeah.
I'd have to go look at, but she didn't know where she was really.
She really didn't know where she was. And in Brooklyn, she could walk to get groceries and walk to get a sandwich. And,
Yeah,
she didn't know the neighborhood at that point.
yeah.
Yeah,
So I
yeah,
thought that was, that's when to me it really hit home to her.
yeah. And the fact that she and her beloved man could not live in the same house.
Hmm.
And I had to get around that. So I created a duplex.
I thought that was so clever, and he was so clever,
I
and
loved
I
him.
just, he's like, there is that thing, like here's the white male as who's like the hero, the guy on the
Yeah,
shiny
yeah,
on the white horse with the big
yeah.
hat and all that stuff, and
Yeah, I know.
but they couldn't ride off into the sunset, but they
Mm-mm.
came as
No,
close as they could
yeah.
during that period.
And he was the son of an incredibly prejudiced family. His father, in particular,
Hmm.
would have just, been
Oh God.
appalled to see that he had a black grandchild,
Hmm.
a white and black grandchild. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for making that map. Still getting a lot of use out of that map.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm
Yeah,
so glad, Brandon.
yeah.
Yeah, that was weeks in the making, but a joy when I finally
I
finished
do,
it.
I do the same thing. I'm often wheeling my chair over there and then checking something real quick and going
Yeah,
back, and it's
yeah,
just really great to have it that size.
yeah. Do you
So,
have the one that I gave to Catherine? Oh,
mhm.
I'm
Yes,
so glad.
yes.
And it's kind of wrinkled, but the photos that Mark took are just fabulous, detailed.
Yeah,
Yeah, because
yeah.
he
He
was a
basically did what you guys did with your
yeah,
phones, I guess, but he really
yeah.
got it in great detail. I took it to UNCC to scan it too because they have the giant scanners there and they were scanning the big maps for us anyway. But they sent it back to me, and Mark's photo was better than the
Oh,
scan they did.
oh, good,
Yeah,
good, good, good.
yeah, couldn't
Well,
top it.
it's big to scan. What, 3 or 4 feet? Yeah.
Do we have any questions from the audience? I don't know how that is relayed to us in the chat. I want the host and other guests, but
You have any, Jackson? Any questions? You're in the audience. Okay. My son is here, and I asked him if he had questions.
Brandy, can you touch on the resources that you have for anyone who wants to study maybe the Beatties Ford Road corridor and the development of that after Brooklyn?
Yeah, yeah. I got a NEH grant to do a digital map of the neighborhoods around here. So it's called westendcharlotte.org, and it's a pretty cool little site that I spent a lot of time on. Just trying to just nail down all the important locations that were in this neighborhood. I mean, there were a lot. I mean, not the churches and the schools, but also, some important civil rights leaders locally were lived
Hmm.
here, born here. And there's a lot of. I mean, people keep coming to JCSU thinking that we have a lot of stuff on those neighborhoods, and I wish we did, but unfortunately, a lot of that stuff did end up at not unfortunately, I'm glad it ended up somewhere, but a lot of stuff is at UNCC or with you guys, the Carolina Room. But I've been doing my best to kind of accumulate all those resources in one place so that people don't have to go out and look for them in all the little disparate places that they.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm trying to do right now with the urban renewal neighborhoods in Brooklyn. So
Mm-hmm.
creating a site that's like a digital resource hub for
Yeah.
all, because everyone's got a piece of it.
Yeah, well,
Seems
we started back in the early 90s when we had the idea to document the photographic history of African American history up until about the 1950s, from about as close as we could get to after Reconstruction. We didn't get as many images as we would like, but were able to get a lot during the late 1800s up to about 1940s. It's really strong. And we went to Pat Rickman, who was the manager of the Carolina Room at the time, and she took a photographer, and they just went out to all the churches and organizations, requested donors. A lot of library staff, people donated photographs of their family living in the Brooklyn area, especially along Hill Street. And we collected, I think, well over 900 images. And that first book, African American Album 1, sold out
Yeah.
very quickly. It's a beautiful book, and you can look at it online now. It was republished, and I'm sorry, I cannot think of the thriving something, but Fannie Flono is the editor, and that's the second version, and it's sold out. It's no longer in print. The African American Album 2, back in the day
Was
when
on, wasn't
CDs
that,
were hot.
yeah, on DVD.
Yeah, it was on a
Yeah.
DVD, and they can't run on anything now. But
Right.
we're working on creating an online resource for
Oh,
that,
good.
and because it has these great Sanborn maps, and you can click on them, and you could up
Hmm.
pop a picture of what was there, like the
Hmm.
Lincoln Theater or
Yeah.
the McCrory Y,
Yeah. Or the
um,
library.
the library, Brevard Street Library, which was the first African American library in
Right.
the state. Um, was wonderfully used. It was just worn out by the time it really was probably needed to be replaced.
Hmm.
But it had merged with the main library, which served this entire
Hmm.
uptown area. But what's funny is, like you said, they really never did much with Second Ward except build some hotels and
Yeah.
Marshall Park and the
And
education
the
center.
big business buildings on McDowell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm. And
Um,
you and
one thing I've recently thought was just sort of ironic was the all the talk now about Brooklyn Village, the big
mhm.
tower that they're going to build that they say will be multi-level housing. I hope that's true, and they're going to call it Brooklyn Village. And when I first heard that, I thought it's like the name Brooklyn is something fondly to be remembered, and we tore it down. And I just find irony in that.
I
I'm
hope
glad they're
maybe they
doing it,
take
and
just
I
the
hope the name Brooklyn does survive.
I
But
hope
I
it
do
does, but I
find,
would like it just be the park and a memorial, the
hmm,
Brooklyn
yeah,
Park, and people
yeah,
could learn about. But
yeah,
to me, it should just be like the Second Ward development because, and a
hmm,
lot of people don't realize how integrated the four wards were up
hmm, right,
until oh 1940s and 50s
right,
when people started moving out to the suburbs.
right,
I mean, to go to high school,
yeah,
man, it was a big deal to go to Second Ward, and it was a big deal to go to Central High School.
yeah, yeah. Central. My older sister went to Central. Yeah, a woman I met through work and through she worked for me was an African American woman had a house in Third Ward that she over 30 some years paid for as a domestic, and uh, her life is part of Tomorrow's Bread. I used her story in Tomorrow's Bread, but she had white neighbors up and down the street, and this was in Third Ward. And her front yard was one of the most gorgeous gardens I've ever seen.
Mhm.
She had a real green thumb, and she just loved plants. And so, and it was an integrated neighborhood.
It really was. And
Yeah,
people just don't understand, that coexisted. Now, granted, it wasn't
yeah,
perfection by any stretch of the imagination because
right,
she was probably a domestic and the person next door was maybe sold insurance or
yeah,
something and had a
yeah,
better
Yeah,
exactly.
that's one
income.
of those things that you really learn when you read Tom's book about
Yeah,
how integrated those neighborhoods
Oh yeah,
all really were, and,
yeah,
yeah.
and yeah, they weren't perfect, but that was the ideal. I think
mhm.
we were. It feels like we really had opportunity at that point early on to do
Do you
something.
all see Charlotte as resegregated?
Oh,
Oh
yes.
yeah,
That's what
It
I keep
happened
hearing. That's what I
the
keep
100%.
hearing.
minute they passed that. They decided to do away with the integration of the schools. They said that,
Mhm,
oh, you met it. Don't have to worry about it anymore. It immediately, within
mhm,
5 years, it
mm,
really went back to segregated schools.
mm,
And the majority of people, young people who attend public education, are a
mhm,
minority. They are
mhm,
not white. And that was not the case.
mhm,
And I had friends who went to, sent their white children off to West Charlotte, had the best experience of their
Mm-hmm.
life. They talk about it with great fondness. Pamela Grundy's
Mm-hmm.
written a great book about West Charlotte's history, but it is sad in some ways, and also the social culture now. But I think there is an effort, and Charlotte likes to do things that are good for business,
Yeah,
Oh, of
and
absolutely.
course. And Brooklyn was good for business.
good, and
Hmm.
integration is good for business. When you
If
can,
that would just be realized.
yeah, and so um, we'll see what happens. We've made strides in some areas in politics. A lot of our leading local politicians are African Americans, and we're now having Latino and other cultures represented on our
Hmm.
school boards as well as in the county commission and city council. So, it's this time of change. Let's see. No,
Yeah,
no.
but
Well, making it the why did you choose
I
not to
wonder
have
how that
any
works.
real people such as the mayor of Charlotte? This is from Ruth Alt.
Okay. Ruth. Okay. Ruth Alt. Um, Stan Brookshire was the mayor at the time,
Mhm.
and he's in one of the photos of the video, as a matter of fact, driving a big machine to tear down a house. Um, I didn't on purpose because it's only been now 60 years, and um, people are still living who would have known the real people. And so that's why I didn't. And the characters are based on real people, like the mayor and the city council and the redevelopment commission, I mean.
And the newspaper was involved in this as well.
Yes, absolutely involved. Yeah. Oh, yeah. One of the titles of a newspaper article that's in the video talks about funding for the slum clearance. Yeah.
And
And
there's a lot of headliners that would make you go, boing.
yeah, I know. But
But
I
Stanford,
purposely didn't use real people.
now he did have a committee that helped, that was devoted to, how can I say, during the war, the drugstores and the sit-ins
Hmm.
that
Oh,
helped.
yes.
He did
Yes, and
have
I
a,
used that in the book. And for Ruth Alt's question,
yeah.
he did take, he got white businessmen and black businessmen to go together to
Mhm.
restaurants like the City Club, which would never have seen a black patron. And so Brookshire did do that. He wanted to do that to head off some of the things that were happening in Greensboro.
Yeah.
But he did some good things. I think he
And
was a good mayor, but he was a mayor during segregation.
man of his times, as we say,
Yep.
but
Yeah.
he did try to integrate the restaurants and the snack
Hmm.
bars, and
Yeah.
eventually that became the movies
Yeah.
and the hospitals. That was
Yes.
a major thing.
Yes.
And all of that was because, if you read, we've got his papers from that committee, and it was all
Hmm.
because it meant good business.
Yes. Absolutely. All of it was for business.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions? That was a great question. Thank you,
Yeah. It
Ruth.
really was.
Because that's the first thing that pops up in my head when I'm either reading or watching a novel, and like they'll have a historical figure in it, and I'll be like, no, they didn't. But we can't do that with you because you beautifully captured
Oh,
characters and created characters who were based on real people,
yeah.
but we can't go back and say, oh
Yeah.
no, they didn't. But
Exactly.
and I think that's a great way to teach history in a way,
I
because
hope so.
when I was growing up, I would read something like your book, and then I would go read the
Hmm.
facts.
Yeah. One thing I heard recently is that To Kill a Mockingbird is now in danger of not being on a good reading list. It has the N word in it, and it has some, rough things. And it is a magnificent book of its time. And I just hope we don't get away from novels teaching us. Stories are accessible.
Well, I'm born in 1958, and if you talk to the vast majority of women of my period,
Hmm.
they will tell you that the book that had the biggest impression on them is To Kill a Mockingbird.
Exactly. Exactly.
Because that's when your eyes open.
Yeah.
Because this was, I grew up during a time when segregation was coming
Yeah.
to an end,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Integration was the way forward, and
Yeah.
you wanted to be a part. You wanted to be
I
on the
know.
right side
I know.
of right, you know.
Yeah. It was set in the 30s, I think. And I'm right now reading A Time to Kill,
Yeah,
because I think is Grisham's finest book. I really
I think
do.
so. Yeah,
And it's set in that time when it was just okay for a white man to go out and rape a black woman.
exactly.
And we need to keep that in mind. There are people who will say the Holocaust didn't exist, didn't happen. And there are going to be people who say segregation didn't happen. It wasn't that bad.
Or Jim Crow wasn't that
Or
bad,
Jim Crow
or
wasn't that bad. And Jim
and
Crow was still alive and healthy in the 60s.
yeah, oh, very much so.
Yeah.
And I'm sure if you go to some parts of the United States, it's still quite
Mhm.
active.
Mhm.
It
I
plays
want
out in different
to give a
scenarios.
shout to Brandon. He knows this because it's in my acknowledgments in the book. But I needed to know if a black woman professor with master's degree and all the education could get a job in a white university doing black history, and I couldn't find one. So I thought, well, she could probably work at Johnson C. Smith.
Mhm.
And she wanted to teach in a law school. And so I called Brandon, and it turned out there was no law school there. Is there now?
No,
There wasn't in the 60s. And he
no,
helped me. He gave me the name of a course that she could well have taught there.
yeah,
Yeah.
Black history didn't really, it sort of evolved about the same time as women's history
Yeah.
in the late 60s and 70s, and
Yeah.
that's when you started seeing that as a popular course.
Yeah.
Um, it was hard for any woman, black or white, with a PhD to get, and still is, to
Yeah.
get a teaching job in history. They
Yeah.
are few and far between.
Oh, isn't that
Uh,
interesting? I never thought about that. Yeah.
yeah, I thought about the PhD route once, and so
Hmm.
I noticed if you wanted to get a job in Rhode Island, you may,
Hmm.
but if you wanted to get a, unless you wrote a fantastic dissertation that was published and well received,
Hmm.
then you could get a
Hmm.
pick of a good
Yeah.
job.
Yeah. I loved what Tekla brought out about the women in the novel, or the female characters in the novel, all kind of defying a little bit as much as they could,
Mhm.
the stricture within what they lived. Yeah.
I
And
like that.
Lorelei certainly falling in love with a white man was just not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean that's just,
Hmm.
and you kind of wonder, do people sort of take that as, oh, the black women on the a plantation, enslaved women did not have
Right.
a say, but she had a say.
Yeah.
She fell in love and she chose,
Yeah.
and
Exactly.
as did as did her husband,
Yeah.
and she called him my Mr. So and so.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I can't think of his name right now.
Yeah. I know.
So well, we've got about 15 minutes. I want to show this video.
Oh, good.
Yolanda, I think we all disappear. And if we do, thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. I hope you learned something. I want to thank AJ, and she's going to be, um, tomorrow night, she's going to be reading from her book, and I'm going to be watching that as well. And
Good.
Brandon, thanks to you for, as always. You're my man. We help each other out on projects all the time.
I know.
And
I don't know what I would do without you either.
oh, bless your heart.
Well,
What
So,
would I have done without both of you?
well, we're glad we're here,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
we love what we do, and we love helping folks like you. In fact, I've been invited to help on a young writer who's writing mystery novels set in Charlotte come up with scenarios. So,
Oh, wonderful.
awesome. Well, good to see
Wonderful.
you again, AJ.
Same
Always.
here, Brandon.
okay, Yolanda, this is a video, a song by Melissa Summersell,
And my
and
son, Jackson Fall, who
her.
collected the photos for it.
Yes, and these photos, for the most part, are from our collection in the Carolina
Yes.
Room. So I
Yes.
hope you will enjoy this look back at Brooklyn. Do check us out at cmstory.org. Do check out the community read at cmlibrary.org. And have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Sheila.
Bye
Thank you,
bye.
Brandon.
Bye.
Let her rip, Yolanda. Okay. What is that?
I do not need my freedom when I'm dead. I cannot live on tomorrow's bread.
Neighbors wave on streets of a town within a town, sipping tea on peaceful porches. Some of them are broken down. When we got free, we settled here. Our school and church bells rang. For years and years this was our home, until the dozers came. Down by Little Sugar, along Second and Pearl, nestled in North Carolina. This town was our whole world. Generations building families, proud of what they became. Black was black and white was white, but love was all the same. The town of Brooklyn lived and breathed. The people were its heart. Imperfect, yes, but it was ours, even with its rougher parts. The letters came in 61, said it would be torn down. And so began the needless death of our town within a town. Different and misunderstood, picked apart till it was good and gone. They made uptown out of our town, promised we'd be better off. That promise broke, but worst of all, our community was gone. They raised our dead, tore down our homes, and now tall buildings stand where we once lived and loved and laughed. Gone for progress of the man. Gone for progress of the man.